started. I'm Dixie Ecklund. I'm the Director of Operations at the Clinical Trial Statistical and Data Management Center at the University of Iowa. Closer to the mic. I'm going to sit like this the whole time.
Yeah.
I don't know how to hold the microphone.
You can like Monty Hall it.
Oh, let's sit up here. Is that better? Okay, all right, we'll do that. All right. So I'm here as an operations person. I am also an IRB person, if you have certain questions along that, but have done many, many clinical trials through. I've been almost 20 years at the NINDS-CTMC, and before that I was the nurse manager of our clinical research center at the University of Iowa for about 20 years. So I've been at the bedside, and I've also been involved in planning and implementing different trials. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the things you consider once you go to a multi-center clinical trial. So, you know, a lot of you I know are working in a single center space, but the goal is to have some kind of go, no-go, to move out and see whether you can go for phase 3. And at that point, you're definitely going to need multiple sites to participate. There's also, you know, if you're in a rare disease space, you might need to work with a couple of different partners so that you can find the patients that would be appropriate for your project. So Bill Clark was the director of the CTS-DMC for many years, from '89 till about 2009 when Chris Coffey came. And he gave a talk once and said, you know, so do you want to do a clinical trial? Everyone should do one, at least once. And that still stands up. You should do one at least once and then decide whether that's for you. There's also different perspectives in what it takes when you're involved in research and clinical trials, and that varies depending on whether it's the clinician investigator, the study coordinator, the participant, the sponsor, the lawyers, the IRB. Everybody looks at it a little bit differently, and this is an old slide, but it holds up too, because all of those perspectives go into multi-center clinical trials. So operationalizing a multi-site clinical trial, you want to think about the logistical considerations early in the grant process. That's partly why I'm here, is to talk you through some of those issues that you might not think about until you actually encounter that particular question coming to you. I know a lot of times when we work with early career investigators, you think that things are going to be done as they are at your institution. That standard of care is as at your institution. And it's amazing how that varies across the country, and then much less, you know, if you get into Canada or doing European studies. They're just different standards, and they're all appropriate. Sometimes it's driven by insurance, sometimes it's not, but that can be an expectation as an investigator of a multi-site trial that you would expect everyone would do that the way you do that, the way you were trained, and that just might not be the case. So we need to plan ahead for those things. The biggest goal is no surprises with the budget or during trial implementation. That's one of my rules. You have to think about everything that can go wrong, because it will at some point or another, and plan accordingly. So the first step is to get a good team together. There is not a PI in the world that can do this on their own. Even if you're just seeing 10 patients at your particular institution, you still need to partner with people who are maybe doing labs or you know, doing different assessments or doing some kind of data entry. So a good project manager on site, especially if you're going to do a multi-center clinical trial, is absolutely vital to making the project succeed. And you're also going to have someone sponsoring, some, you know, the money's coming from somewhere, even if it's your department. There's someone that's going to be interested in what the results are of your project. There may be other co-investigators. I know there's a lot of collaboration going on here, which is really helpful in this kind of space, because everybody brings a little different take to the table. You might be working with coordinating centers like we have at Iowa, or there's at MUSC, Wake Forest, multiple places. And then participating in clinical sites for multi-site clinical trials. Now the single IRB is very common in multi-site clinical trials and actually mandated in NIH projects phase 3. and the vendors that you might need to work with. There's often a steering committee, a protocol steering committee, folks who are going to be helping you with decisions that come up as you implement the multi-center clinical trial and come up with, oh, we might need to revise the protocol because we're seeing this, or this particular problem is coming up. And a data safety monitoring board is also, an independent data safety monitoring board is also incredibly useful, actually required in a lot of senses, to evaluate safety as you're ongoing in your multi-site clinical trial. How do you get that team all to work together? A well-written protocol is crucial. It needs to be very clear. You can't put every detail into the protocol, but you can have companion study materials that can be helpful, including a MOP, a manual of procedures, training materials, education modules. You want to design a way to collect your data. It's been more than a few times that someone's come to Chris or I at Iowa and said, you know, I got this grant, but I didn't think about how I was going to collect data. You know, now it's often required in NIH projects that you name an independent data coordinating center, but there needs to be a well thought out mechanism for collection of data, which it can be accomplished through REDCap and other mechanisms, but that still requires someone to understand what it takes to design CRFs, how to ask the questions, how to make sure that you get the proper information. Well thought out data and safety monitoring plans is critical. Think about it ahead of time. How are you going to know if there were adverse events? How are you going to sort out whether they were related to whatever the intervention is, or is it the course of the disease? How will you characterize those? How will you classify those? There's a lot of different ways to do that, but you know, the more rigor you put into it up front, the easier it is to find those signals that you might be looking for. SOPs, standard operating procedures, across multiple sites, so that you know how people will be conducting the trial the same at every different site. You can have all the education materials that you want, but there should be an underlying understanding of, you know, the basics. Everyone has to have informed consent. Everyone needs to, you know, respond to the appropriate regulations or GCP kind of thinking to get things done. Effective communication plans are huge, so that all the teams know who to go to if they have a question. Some studies have a hotline, especially if you're working in an acute illness, so that folks are aware who to call if they have a problem. Sorting through eligibility questions, sorting through how to work the data system if there's a problem, and an escalation plan if there are things that need to be addressed for, you know, a site performance issue, or, you know, someone is going on leave unexpectedly, things like that, to cover all of those things. And of course you need adequate funding to get a well-run multi-center clinical trial. So first step in your study planning and startup is develop realistic timelines. You know, it's easy enough to say pie in the sky, but often with most of the projects we work on now, NIH is requiring that we give them milestones. There's a lot of projects that start with like a UG3, UH3 mechanism. UG3 gives you a planning year, and to release the UH3 funds, which might be for the next 4 to 5 years to actually do the clinical trial, they will require that you get everything set up and enroll at least one participant at each site, or, you know, a certain percentage of the participants. And they will hold you to it. They will not give you the UH3 funds if you do not achieve that. So it's important to think through all those things very carefully, and to talk to the partners that you're working with so that you are able to achieve those goals. Don't try to, you know, pull the wool over their eyes and say, oh yeah, we're going to be up and recruiting, you know, in 3 months, and you know, and you have no site contracts, or, you know, haven't thought about all the time that it takes to accomplish all of those things. So realistic timelines. Think about, you know, how you're going to select your sites. how you're going to get drug or supplies or devices or whatever it is to the sites, what kind of training they need, what the data collection system, you'll hear me talk about that a lot because I'm from a data center, so that's always near and dear to my heart. How the contracts go. We do a lot now with master contracts so that it covers, you know, everyone under the project, including master data use agreements, master material transfer agreements, so that, you know, specimens can be shipped, data can be shipped, all of those things. It takes some time to get them from the very beginning, but it's a very useful thing if you and with a single IRB, that's helpful too, to get people to recognize that. And of course, IRB approvals at every site. So when you get to the point where you're actually ready to start the study, more thinking around the realistic timelines is, you know, thinking ahead about what you want to report on and who it's going to go to for that reporting. So, you know, what kind of tools are you going to use? Recruitment reports, retention reports, data completion reports, safety reports, blinded reports, many reports and who will prepare them, who will review them, and who's the audience, and how do you assure that that is all communicated appropriately so everyone is aware. I think it's probably a statistician's nightmare that, you know, all this work goes into reports and it's like the PI never looked at them. Okay, so we put them under their nose at the study team call and go through them step by step so that they're aware that, you know, this site hasn't recruited in this long, or this site is, you know, behind on data completeness, you know, all the things that go into a successful trial. And you should always be thinking about how you're going to close out the study, even from the very beginning. When you're writing the grant, even, you know, have in mind what that looks like, what that's going to take, what the timelines are going to do. You know, and, you know, my examples here are for bigger trials with, you know, maybe 10, 15, 20, 30, you know, you could have 100 centers, but, you know, to get to that point, you know, whether it's one center or 50, it's almost the same amount of work for having a data collection system, having all the reporting tools, having, you know, the supplies. You know, some things you get economies of scales, but other things it requires the same amount of work, no matter how many centers there are. We'd start thinking about data cleaning and database lock from the very beginning, doing, you know, on-site monitoring, doing remote monitoring, doing statistical monitoring, reviewing reports, looking for discrepancies, running queries, all of that from the very beginning, and getting to the point of, you know, the very end when you're going to close out. We've had a lot of experience with NINDS that, you know, often we have all the study clinical results in the database, but we might be waiting for the PK samples that are being run by a vendor. And one of our examples, it was in India, and it was during the pandemic, and getting all of the samples to India, getting a result back, and we weren't able to lock the database until we had that merged in with the clinical data because it was part of the portfolio. And, you know, our DSMB does not look favorably on us reporting some results without the complete package. Even if you know, whether it will change or not, whether it will impact the results, you know, those are all things. But the perception is there. So we usually have to keep the database open until all of that data has been entered in and cleaned and locked, and then we run the analyses, and then deliver the preliminary results to the investigators. So for analysis and reporting, the statistical analysis plan, your statistician, oh, it's back. I said the word SAP and the computer shut down, Chris. So the SAP is, you know, you have a preliminary SAP when you start. FDA may want to look at a SAP along the way. DSMB may look at a SAP as well, but the SAP absolutely needs to be finalized and signed off on before data lock, and you give any results to the PI so that there's no perception of any data changing before anyone has seen that data. You have to think about the final study report, whether it's to FDA or DSMB or the PI or and what your dissemination plan is. And that includes to the patients, to the other participating sites, as well as manuscript preparation and data sharing. And then keep track of your timelines and hope things like COVID don't happen. NINDS has some good tools to use if you're thinking about any project, multi-center or single center. This is from their website, the Clinical Research Toolkit. And this is not a complete list of everything that's available there, including things like the data sharing policy, the inclusion of women and minorities. Data sharing, that's a new policy that came into effect in January of 2023. So there's specific language that you need to address with data sharing. The clinical trials checklist, whether it's an applicable clinical trials and whether you need to report it on ct.gov. The single IRB policy, how to develop your budget. Monitoring guidelines includes, safety monitoring, single IRB monitoring. There's a nice protocol template in there that you can pick up and use, and it gives you pointers on how to fill out all those sections if you have not done that before. And then NINDS common data elements are available, and there's a lot of those that have been developed in many diseases. We've been with NeuroNext like 15 years now, and in the beginning I think there were like 2 diseases, and now there's probably 15 or 20. Traumatic brain injury is probably one of the ones that led the way through FITBER, and then there's others for a lot of the common neurological disorders, as well as general data elements that you can identify and draft your case report forms from that, so that variable names are consistent, because in the end you're going to need to share your data. So one common misconception about writing the protocol is that that's the same as the research strategy. So if you're familiar with a research strategy in a grant application, that's usually limited to 12 pages, and it's very much scientifically heavy. The protocol is actually how you implement a lot of that science into how you're going to answer that question, and that follows a template that I'll show you coming up next. But NINDS has generally, for most of the projects we've worked on, required a protocol to be written at the time of submission. It's part of the RFA, the RFP, the OTA, whatever request you're looking at for submission. And as I said, that will help you describe how the science will be operationalized. These are typical sections in a protocol. The background, the study design, and then how you're going to enroll the subjects, what the interventions are, what the clinical lab evaluations are, how you're going to manage adverse events, what's going to be the criteria to discontinue the intervention, statistical considerations, always section 9, data collection in section 10, human subjects, and publication of your research findings. So, and as I said, there's a lot of template language and tools that help you think about what needs to go in each of those sections. And a lot of times when we start out, somebody will come with about, maybe a 15-page protocol and say, okay, got it started. And most of them end up being, for a multi-center clinical trial, end up being 80, 100 pages easily to get all of this information in there. And the protocol is what drives the SAP. That's what drives the analysis. All of these things need to line up and be taken care of throughout the project. Another point is the specific aims. And I know we've worked on different projects where, let's write the specific aims first, as opposed to, because that's the process, and I think that's part of the CTMC too. How are you going to distill your question down into exactly what those aims are, what that looks like, and then how do you turn those into endpoints that can be measured, and you will know whether you've had success on that particular aim or not. So you want to clearly specify the primary, secondary, and exploratory endpoints, and a thing to note is, and I've seen this a lot as well, where the primary might be well detailed, the secondaries, those all have to go up on ct.gov, and you have to report results on those. And then, we've seen projects where there's multiple secondary endpoints, And often, there's not gonna be enough power for anything. Those all need to be reported. So those might want to be moved over to exploratory endpoints so that you have the data, you're collecting it. It might add to your overall findings, but you won't be required to do all the work that goes into ct.gov when that's not really the point of the project that you're working on. So the budget's the fun part, as far as I'm concerned. When you're putting together a clinical trial budget, you want to have a detailed scope of work document. And then identify who's responsible for what. So, there could be a CCC role, there could be another clinician investigator, there could be a DCC role, a statistician role, the sponsor role, who is responsible for making sure particular pieces of the project are achieved and reporting on them and taking care of all those. And we often have with 3 or 4 columns, including, NIH might be a sponsor, but the financial sponsor might actually be a drug company, someone like that. And then, CCC roles and DCC roles for our NeuroNext projects are laid out in there. One of the tools for budgeting is, that the old days of we're going to pay a coordinator, 100% effort for 5 years to work on this project, and you're going to be expected to recruit this many people. Those are pretty much gone long ago. That was probably in the 2000s. They're typically more, what are the things you're going to do? What's the effort going to be required at the site level to accomplish that? And fund that, on an average of what that would cost. In NeuroNext, we use MGH pricing, which is thought to be probably high and would mostly cover most sites for how you can get that done. But there are, like the cost of an MRI, the cost of a CT, and then, or assessments. Do those have to be done by a physician investigator or a nurse investigator or, a med tech, who can complete those assessments, and what's their hourly time for actually completing those? So that if you're asking a site to spend a full day on screening a person, you need to pay for the actual tests that are being done or provide them as part of your study budget, and then you need to cover the time of the people who will not be productive in clinic or other places because they will be performing the responsibilities of the project. We structure this into what we call the PPF, the participant fee, and that all of those activities are based on what's in the SOA, or the schedule of activities, or the schedule of events. You'll see both of those terms thrown around. So some of the considerations you need to take when thinking about what your budget's going to require is the drug supply and the distribution. So placebo matching is a big ticket item. I've met with a lot of investigators that say, yeah, I was at a conference and I met this guy from Merck and he said, yeah, they'd get me the drug. And, but that usually requires a lot of meetings, a lot of, going through this committee, that committee. So it's not as easy as maybe you get the impression first time around, but that might come true. So we keep working on those because having industry provide drug for, especially for NIH funded projects, can be especially beneficial to both parties involved. So other vendor costs you're going to have is if you have a central laboratory. A lot of times people think, well, we can just have local labs. It's just, safety labs. The reasons that you can or should think about doing a central laboratory is for, the ease of anybody reviewing for adverse events. So they will all be, everyone has to look at what the lab normals are for each lab and know whether that one is, the threshold is here, the threshold is there. We need to report on these if it's 2 times the upper limit, whatever that is. That can vary at different labs, depending on what kind of assay they use. The units people use can vary, and even at big academic centers, we have find lots of differences and have to collect the data in different ways to make sure that we're making the proper sense of it. So central laboratories can be beneficial in that way, but it does take time because they have to be shipped off. So if you need something, you know, today to know whether you go or not, then you might need to use a local lab. EKGs can be centralized or done in-house. There's a lot of discussion in the neurology world about whether neurologists can read EKGs or not. I've heard every discussion around that. Some do, some don't. And you know, for the purposes of the study, that is perfectly fine for an answer. Imaging is also big in neurological studies, and centralized imaging can be very costly because then you need to standardize the machines so that they're running the same protocols. You probably need to do phantoms and dummy scans and all of those things to assure quality control, especially for very specific kinds of imaging as an endpoint. Monitoring is also another cost, whether you have on-site monitors go and review the source document verification, or whether you have direct data entry, how you write in and assure that you have the correct data entered into the system. So central review and risk-based central monitoring all go into those. So if you have an IND or an IDE for the project you're doing, sometimes it's best just to reach out to FDA before you go to the IRB, before you go anywhere, and see what they say about whether you need an IND. Certainly if it's not approved. If it's not approved for that indication, you may or may not need an IND, depending on your institution and what the risk levels are. So, you know, and they're usually quite receptive to responding and answering whether an IND should be submitted. For NINDS, we generally advise that you submit the IND at least 31 days prior to the grant submission deadline, whenever that's planned to be, because FDA then has 30 days to review that, and so then when NIH takes it up, they will know that it has been reviewed through FDA prior to the NIH review. Other study materials to think about are the investigator's brochure, which is typically done by the sponsor of the project. And those get updated, those need to be kept, those need to be delivered to the IRB, the DSMB. The manual procedures, lab manuals, pharmacy manuals, a template for the informed consent so that each site with a single IRB, often there's a template and sections are locked and the sites are only able to, this used to be quite controversial, but I think people are used to it now that we've been doing single IRB for a while. But there's always a site that says, no, my IRB will never do that. And it takes a few questions and a few calls to talk through with them and have them agree that, that this is part of a multi-center trial. We signed a contract, it's under a single IRB. The IRB of record is the single IRB, although there can still be some local review. But the informed consent templates, sections get locked and then they only do local context, and HIPAA waivers can be part of and who to call, who the contact people are. Those are the things that can vary across the templates across different sites. Any kind of source documents they might need. There's a lot of neurological assessments that are pages and pages of worksheets, and then how is that getting entered into the data collection system? Either they just enter the results, do they have to do some calculation and enter that number? We always prefer that not, because then there's human error in there, but how much are they going to enter? We have some projects with neuropsych measures that we actually have a neuropsych person who actually reviews those for, I think, the trail making test. That's one, did they properly complete that? Is it documented so we know that those results are valid? The safety monitoring plan, I listed here below, I did check all my links, they're all up to date as of last week. The guidelines on safety monitoring from NINDS, and they have a really nice document that walks through, is it just the PI that's monitoring safety? Is it the PI and the IRB? That's probably the lowest level of safety monitoring you're going to see for a project. Or is there a medical monitor? Or is there an independent medical monitor? Those have different rules and guidelines as to what their responsibilities are, depending on whether there's a DSMB or not. So it's an independent medical monitor if there's not a DSMB, and then they're also looking at site performance and recruitment and issues like that. If you do require a DSMB, then a medical safety monitor will be suggested who reviews the safety events. And then also, like in NeuroNext, we have them review on a quarterly basis the closed safety reports, and then report to the DSMB as needed. This goes over what I was just talking about, the different kinds of committees and different levels of risk that need to be monitored and who the appropriate people are. So on-site monitoring, so there's data monitoring, there's on-site monitoring, there's safety monitoring. All of these get to the same goal of making sure that the data is properly collected, accurate, and cleaned and input into a source that can be used for analysis. On-site monitoring is still favored by the industry partners, include like up to 4 times a year on-site and reviewing every single document. There is a concept called risk-based monitoring that's been around for several years now, where you identify the high-risk things. So identify whether who has a informed consent sign, who met the eligibility criteria, if all the AEs have been reported, and maybe a sampling of a certain number of CRFs so that you can sample and see whether it feels like that site is properly conducting everything. And also build in all the things within the data collection system so that you can query and check and double check across different things. Another tool is what we call central monitoring. We've done this in projects and had to do this a lot during COVID, where once the first participant was randomized, we would ask them to send us all their source documents, and then we would do a in-house, and to do that you have to have a protective drive, and we delete all that information after a certain amount of time. It's laborious for the sites, but is it more laborious than when someone comes on site and spends all day there? It could reduce the number of on-site hours that you have with the site. So they send in their CRFs or source, whatever that is, and especially ones around the endpoint, eligibility, safety, those kinds of things. And we're also doing a lot of stuff now with central statistical monitoring using like Power BI and R as tools to look for like discrepancies, divergence. It's really nice to look at a graph longitudinally and someone's weight. You think nobody hardly ever thinks about weight unless you're doing a weight study. But people do the conversion thing all the time. They put in pounds or kilos depending on whatever the data entry was, and you can pick that up very easily by because it might be within the bounds of what would be an acceptable range for both. But if you look over time and see, oh my gosh, they're 20, 30 off and from 3 months ago, and it wasn't a weight reduction study, then you might want to explore that a little bit. As far as your partners, the investigators that you're going to work with at other sites, this is not a good time to select your buddies. They might be great friends, but you want to make sure they're also going to be a good investigator. And that means they have to have the appropriate clinical expertise. They have to have adequate staff to perform the studies. They have to have adequate facilities to perform the studies, and a pool of eligible subjects. And this is all from GCP, the 1572. You sign off on all these things saying, yes, I have these things and I am going to do this. And their FDA does have a mechanism to notify you of who are debarred investigators or who have been given a Form 83. There's all kinds of scary things that can go on there, and so obviously you wouldn't want a person like that to be enrolling in your project. So a little bit more about subcontractors and drug supply. as I talked before, is it going to be donated or do you need to buy it? If you're going to buy it, where's it going to go? Who's going to store it? What kind of conditions? You know, not every facility can handle everything. Most academic centers have a research pharmacy, but it's amazing how they vary in what their capabilities are and what they're willing to agree. And I feel like the pandemic was especially hard on the pharmacy partners because they, you know, to the point where there are pharmacies that we are not allowed to send monitors in, and they won't use any of our forms. You know, they have their own systems, and you have to put together whatever. I mean, they will work with you. It's not like they won't work with you. I think it's when I touch that cord. But they are, they just have way too high a workload, and they're not getting all right. Showing on my screen. To the rescue. I'll keep my hand away from there. So while she's trying to save me, the clinical drug supply, you know, you need to assure that you know what the reporting requirements are. Is there one up here? And I know someone here had mentioned they're using a scheduled drug. That's a whole nother layer of, you know, responsibilities that you have to assure that the product is available. And again, placebo matching, which, I mean, we've done studies where they over-encapsulate, but it was a pediatric study, so the capsules get pretty big, and, you know, so now you have to teach the kids how to swallow. There you go.
You're on a second screen or something.
Yeah. Okay, and keep my hands right here. So, and then, you know, packaging and labeling. So if, even if a drug is not an IND, if you're giving it for research purposes, there are, you know, every hospital has requirements that there's proper labeling, that they know what the product is. I mean, I've been doing clinical research for so long. In the old days, back in the 80s, you know, somebody would walk in with a box of drug and it was in their lab, and, you know, we would like mix it up and do something with it. That's all gotten a lot more rigorous for good reasons. But so, you know, whatever the receipt and distribution is, all those details need to get worked out, and that's where you need to work with your pharmacy partners, either as a distributor, within your hospital, whatever the research pharmacy requirements are, who's going to receive it, who's going to store it, who's going to check the temperatures and document all of those things and be able to produce those records if needed. So, as I said earlier, central imaging can be a big component in neurology studies, and you need to think about whether the scanners are comparable, 7T, 3T, you know, what are the sequences that are running through, how are you going to QC. We've had studies where the scanners go down for quite some time, and that was the one scanner at that institution that was doing our research scanning. And so you are kind of either going to find another facility and maybe fly people there if it's important enough, or do without that data. So, but you know, in my experience, you almost have to plan that scanners are going to be down at certain time periods, and that is going to impact your study if you're doing an imaging-heavy project. So, and incidental findings is always an interesting topic that comes up on every imaging kind of study. So, and I've seen every variation of this too, you know. We think we saw something on their scan, but we're not clinicians and we don't know, so who's going to tell who? And the IRB world has gone through, oh, we need to ask the patients if they want us to know if we think there's something, or now it's moved more towards, we're not gonna ask them, but we're going to notify their physician, and then they can explore that with them. I mean, that's what I typically see done now. But all sites have different IRB things and thinking about that, and you know, not one is right or wrong on any of those things. I mean, I think anybody wants to notify someone if you think there's something you saw, but you also don't want to scare them, you know, if that's not appropriate information. So the right people need to be talking to them about that. So again, your data collection, I did a project once, and we got all the way through building everything, getting ready to go, and somebody said, wait, we need to check and make sure we're gonna get our primary endpoint at the end of the day. And I thought, wow, it's a little late, but it really wasn't, because it was before we got started. You know, how you capture that, how you get that data, how you monitor for that, especially, you know, the primary and secondary and safety data, you know, because those have to be of the highest caliber of data collection to assure your trial is done successfully. We always try to limit open text boxes. That's not a useful tool when you're doing multi-center analyses of a particular data point. It can be useful in certain settings, but usually that's also where people end up putting in HIPAA language and all kinds of things that you really don't want to know about in a multi-center kind of trial. So limiting open text boxes, and there's a lot of, oh, it'd be really nice if we could collect that, but you know, you need to outweigh what the burden is to the site and to the participants, to whether you really have a plan with what to do with that data. And that's actually part of IRB thinking too. You know, don't collect more data than you need to actually analyze the project, just because you might want to know something one day, someday down the road. So some of that obviously needs to come in because there's future questions that might need to be answered, but weigh that out with the burden to the site and to the participants. Use the common data elements and have a good data management plan, which a data center should be able to help you with those things. Recruitment you can start thinking about that from the get-go, and I hear people here talking about that already, which is an important step there. You need to understand your populations. We've done studies where before StrokeNet got started, we had a stroke study in NeuroNext, and you know, we didn't have stroke doctors. We had Dr. Wu, who was a stroke doctor, but not all of our sites had stroke doctors. So now, and we had one site where the PI was actually a rehab stroke person. So, you know, that they have different feelers out in their institutions on how to access, especially when you're working with an acute stroke population. You need to be working directly with the people who see those people and can make those decisions. Hello. Goodbye. As opposed to whoever would be coming up to approach the people to participate. A big thing that's come around is removing barriers to participation. I think I'm about out of time, so I need to move along here. And that came out particularly, especially in, you know, because the old IRB thinking was you can't coerce people into doing research, which we still obviously do not want to coerce people into doing research. But you also want to think about removing barriers for people who might be interested in doing research, but it's been, you know, for the privileged few for a long time. You know, it goes back to the original physician health studies, which were mostly Caucasian and males. And so, you know, there are different barriers for different populations. So if you really want to have generalizable results, you need to remove those barriers, which often means leaving your academic institutions and meeting participants where they can be seen, and then participate in the project. Training for study startup. I highly recommend a face-to-face investigator meeting just to get started. We've done Zoom ones, they work, but they take a lot more reinforcement. So for a multi-center trial, everybody collaborating together is huge, and a face-to-face investigator meeting can be very helpful. And then appropriate training. trial master file, these are all the documents that need to be included. We're working now in like pragmatic trials and thinking about how much of this do we really need to have for pragmatic and comparative effectiveness. Well, if it's not FDA regulated, you don't need a 1572. You should have a clear delegation of responsibilities so you know who's trained and who can do which different tasks, including data collection, assessments, informed consent, all of those things. CVs and licenses may not be required for a more pragmatic kind of trial. Laboratory certs and normal ranges, but you're definitely going to need IRB approvals and drug accountability if you're doing a drug study or device study. You need to get all those materials to the sites. Anymore, people put them online and people can download them. These are just examples of the different study tools that can be used for multi-center trials. I don't know if anybody still uses pocket cards, but that used to be a big thing. But sometimes that can be helpful for like inclusion-exclusion criteria, especially for an acute type of study. And then make sure those all get shipped properly and are accounted for. And that can include specimen kits in addition to drug or devices, or study machines, like blood pressure machines and all of those things. The SAP, we talked about that a little bit earlier. Thinking about interim monitoring plans, that's something that often industry partners would like to see. You know, they want to know how far you're going to go before they know whether it's a go. But that, depending on the design you're using, that might not be feasible in the project you're doing. And be prepared for early stopping for futility or safety. We've had a few projects that, you know, the CHAMP study is probably our biggest example, which was pediatric migraine prevention, and it was comparing topiramate and propranolol. Amitriptyline. I'm doing propranolol now. I used to do amitriptyline, but and placebo, and it was 2 to 1, and the placebo kids did the same as the treatment groups after 36, 40. I don't know. I need Chris here to correct me on the details, and that was, you know, headache days at the start, and then a 30-day headache day diary at the end of the observation period. So we stopped early because the first look, which was a third of the way in, there was no differences, and it didn't look like there was going to be any differences from going forward. And the risks, although, you know, were relatively minor, they're kids. And, you know, there was some weight gain. There were some kids who thought, I can't think well on this drug. There was, you know, always concern about suicidality, especially in adolescents, and if they're on some kind of neurological drug that might lead to different thoughts there. So we stopped it early. And of course, that was over the holidays. And so we had to bring everybody in and do closeout studies and make that in an orderly fashion so that we could close out and make sure that we had everything in place. Be thinking about your manuscript preparation. It's really helpful to publish the protocol paper ahead of the final results paper, because that you can detail everything that you set up and are doing in the project, and then you don't have to spend a lot of time in your analysis paper talking about all of those specific things you can reference to the protocol paper. A baseline paper is also helpful if you have a really large study that's it's going to contribute to the overall dissemination of that particular project. And finally, data sharing. The new policy as of January 23, you need to submit a data sharing plan. It looks a little obtuse if you've never written in this language, so you should talk to someone who has experience with it. You need to identify what variables you're collecting and how you're going to share them. There is, you know, NINDS has a data repository, and we've deposited many studies there. And then you can request data if you want to use that for some project that you're working on. So I urge you to go look at that site and think about whether, you know, that could help you with the preliminary findings that you're working on with your project. Right now they're in some kind of transition, so something's kind of closed down for a little while, but I'm sure it will be back up and running soon. And if you're using ct.gov, which almost any clinical trial anymore has to do that, you're required to report your results within 1 year of the last patient, last visit for the primary endpoint. So if your primary endpoint is early on, that requirement still sticks unless you get a waiver for some reason or another. So that's my last slide. Everyone should do a clinical trial more than once and have some fun along the way.